So my name's Chris Saynor, and I work for an organization called EDItEUR. I've been with EDItEUR since end of 2016, and I look after some of our standards, the ONIX, Thema, and EDItEX. Prior to that, I was working in Paris for an ONIX solutions provider. I've been a member of the French Metadata Committee, the North American one and the UK ones, and prior to that, I was a bookseller in France and in the UK. Okay, EDItEUR, for those of you who don't know, is everybody familiar with EDItEUR? Anybody not? Okay. So we're a not-for-profit organization. We're based in London. We basically develop, support, promote metadata and identification standards for the book supply chain, the global book supply chain. We're a membership organization, but all our standards, of course, are free to use. We have members in 28 countries. I think we have over 100 members at the moment, from all sectors of the supply chain. So publishers, retailers, standards organizations, BNC is a member, libraries, that kind of thing. We also provide services to other organizations. So, for example, the current executive director of the International ISNI Agency is also an employee of EDItEUR, and we provide management services to them as well as to the DOI Foundation. There's only 2 full-time staff members, myself and Graham Bell, who some of you may know, and we have 2 part-time members. The family of standards that we maintain, so ONIX for books is probably the one you're most familiar with. We also have one for serials. There are some other ONIX messages. We have Thema, the subject classification, which I'll talk a bit more about today, and EDItX, which is a series of transactional messages, which we are currently updating to harmonize with ONIX 3. So basically, any business model that can be expressed in ONIX 3, you can now start expressing that in the sales reports, sales tax reports, inventory reports, ordering. So those are our standards. So my talk today. There are a lot of books being published, and amongst them there's some amazing books from a diverse range of authors. There are books that help us there are books that we can identify with ourselves. There are books that help us understand other people, the world we live in, the times we're living in. There are books that push our boundaries and help us see things or people through different eyes. And then there are books that are simply inclusive and extend our vision on a diverse society. But sometimes it can feel like those diverse voices are very hard to find. We're only giving them the slimmest chance of actually being heard. So I want to discuss today how metadata can perhaps help with that. So why am I saying this? So as part of the work on Thema, so there are 2 projects we're doing with Thema at the moment. We're starting to get ready for the next version of Thema, which will be 1.4. But we're also producing more help documentation. So I'm working on a document that will be an extended version of this talk. And so I've been doing research. And I came across a book on a list done by a librarian of books on diversity and inclusion. But before I decided to put it into the document, I thought I should go and have a look at the book. So I went to one of London's largest booksellers to search for these titles. I asked them if they had it in stock. They didn't. And then I explained what I was looking for. And they very nicely explained, what we do is when we see a book come in that fits into one of our diversity and inclusion categories, we keep a list at the cash desk and we write them down. And then we will put them in a section. And so she took me to show me some of the books they had in stock, and then she said this to me as a plea: if only there was an easy way for publishers to send us this information. Now, there may be many reasons why that bookseller wasn't actually getting that end information, but I did think this was a very good summary of maybe one of the issues. So I've had a very, very good keynote this morning, talking a lot about diversity and inclusion. So I just thought I found these 2 quotes, and I thought they would be a good, useful summary of how important it is these 2 words are always thought of together. I particularly like the second one, Diversity is being asked to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. But I also feel I'm in Canada, and I don't really need to explain what diversity and inclusion is to a Canadian audience. As a country, you come out quite well when we're thinking about countries that have taken the issues of diversity and inclusion seriously. I lived in France for a long time where the discourse is not yet at the same level. So another quote I found. So this was in an interview for NPR entitled, Diversity in Book Publishing Isn't Just About Writers, Marketing Matters Too. And this, I recommend having a read of this article, it's very interesting. And I found this quote in it. The independent bookstore is by far our best friend and underused. It's about getting the book to the bookseller, putting on the staff recommended shelf. It's about giving an independent bookseller enough information so they would choose to hand sell it. If you get enough, so one of the examples they give is making sure the right data is sent out with the galleys, so prior to purchase or with advanced information, so that a bookseller, be that an independent bookseller, an online, a chain, or anybody has the right information to talk about it. What matters to booksellers is you want to be able to choose the books that you're going to put on your recommended shelf. You want to look through 10 books and choose 2. What often happens is you look through hundreds of books to find that 2. So to illustrate that, as part of my research, I went to meet 2 booksellers in North London. I live in London, so I've done most of the research in London because it's easier. And I must admit, it's pretty pleasant kind of research going from bookshop to bookshop, talking to people. So Callie and Steve, who work in the Willesden bookshop, which is a great bookshop. If you've read White Teeth by Zadie Smith, this is the bookshop she used to go to as a child with her mother, and she launched White Teeth at this bookshop. Unfortunately, the physical bookshop had to close down. As happens in London, they redeveloped it to build a condo. But they still run a subscription business for schools, libraries, nurseries, other institutions, as a specialist in multicultural children's books. So I was curious to find out from them how they found those books, how they chose. Both of them are incredibly experienced booksellers, so they know what they're doing. But they showed me some of the things they do when they'll get an order from a school that's got a very diverse pupils from different backgrounds, so they may be looking for bilingual books or books that talk about the countries that the children come from. And so they go and search. So there's 2 major wholesalers in the UK, so they use their sites, and there's the data distributors. So they have access to those as professionals, but so often what they see is one children's book code. It says children's fiction, and maybe there's a very brief description. There may be reasons they may not have paid the full subscription to have access to fuller data or something, but so often what they see is very little. They have a principle: they will never sell a book to any institution that they haven't checked themselves. So they do a lot of pre-ordering so they can read the books. So it's about, for them, having to order 100 books to find the few books that they're actually going to sell. They also showed me the website of a major London-based publisher that has just updated its website for marketing purposes, but you can't actually find any books by subject now. So they've stopped ordering from that publisher because they can no longer find, because the publisher stopped producing catalogues and doesn't give any information. The whole website's designed to be retweeted. Or at least we couldn't find anything on the website that was by subject. So it's about giving booksellers, librarians, educators, readers enough information so they can make an informed choice. The information that you can send in metadata is really important. And why? Well, we all know that the value of metadata is about the discoverability. So giving the potential reader or the potential seller, the librarians or the educators, the data so they can decide if that title is is the right book they're looking for. When we're sending the data out or displaying the data, some of that data will be displayed publicly and some of that will be available internally or just on professional sites. There may be data that, for commercial reasons, people won't actually show on a public-facing site, but it's good to give access to people in the business. There's two types of searches as well. There's the known item, title, author, subject. So somebody's looking for a book on a particular subject, they're going to look for that. Unknown item search, again, people are looking by subject, a controlled vocabulary, by keywords, the uncontrolled vocabulary. There was an interesting talk on keywords before. And descriptive texts. Descriptive texts are really important. I'm not going to go into detail on descriptive text, but when it comes to discovering books about diversity and inclusivity, the descriptive content can be really important. The description of the title, but also working with the contributors to create a biography that, if the author is in agreement, explores their identity. A table of contents can also be an incredibly rich source of information. And you need that discovery to be able to turn into sales. That's what's important for the publishing industry. So, what metadata matters? Subject codes, Thema. I'm going to talk about Thema because I know Thema very well, but some of the things I'm going to show you will also apply to the BISAC codes, which are used here in Canada and in the US. Something you can send in your ONIX or in other metadata files, the edition type. Things like, are the contents of this book available in different formats, the large print or the Braille? Is it a bilingual book? Bilingual books are very important, especially for schools. Books for dyslexic readers, high readability. Data about metadata around the contributors, so their biographies, as I suggested earlier, and also information about places that are associated with them. Information about language, so what language the book is in. If the book was translated, what language was it translated from? Because reading a translated novel or translated non-fiction can often give you a different perspective on the same thing. Accessibility metadata. The ONIX code list 196. I know accessibility is taken very seriously in Canada. It's really important that if you've got an accessible title, the metadata about that accessibility information is also sent. We shouldn't be creating books that are supposed to be inclusive and yet excluding an audience, the print-impaired readers, by not making those books available in an accessible format. Relationships between products. Is there something else that exists? Is there an audio version? Is there a large print version? Is there a Braille version? Is there an accessible version? That kind of thing. And then supply information. So going back to the Willesden Bookshop, they said they keep finding books that are published in Canada and the US that are really good, that they'd like to order, but they can't find out who to order it from. There's no information. It gives a US supplier or a Canadian supplier and nothing else. So the information about where that book is available is really important as well. So I'm going to look at a bit more in detail into subject categorization. So as you all know, subject classifications of books, audio books, digital books, is a really important key to merchandising, to discoverability, to sales, and to market intelligence. By adding the right Thema codes or the right BISAC codes, it gives you tools to create lists for people who are looking for particular books. It also gives you tools so that you can start collecting data and statistics about are books that are classified like this selling more. It was one of the points in the keynote this morning about having data about the sales linked to specific groups and giving those diverse voices a chance to sell. It's one of the key access points for discoverability, subject classification. And again, you aim to increase the sales by highlighting books that are most appropriate to what these particular customers seek, if they are educators, they're librarians, if they're booksellers, or if they're the end reader. So, Thema. Are you all familiar with Thema? Anybody not? Okay. So, we call it the subject category scheme for a global book trade because it is a scheme that was created by an international group. Canada has very good representation in the creation of Thema. There are two very, very active groups. There's one run by the BNC, and there's one run by the BTLF in Montreal. And there are groups from all over the world who contribute to the creation of Thema. So it's truly international. There is various documentation available from the EDItEUR website. So this is what the website looks like. And so we have various documents that you might find useful if you want to know more about Thema. And one of the documents we did was this briefing paper, Diversity and Inclusivity in Thema 1.3. This was born out of a question somebody asked us, so we wrote a reply, and then we thought it would turn into an interesting paper. This has actually become the second most downloaded document from our website, which is encouraging. And this is a document that I am working on creating a whole new set of worked examples to show people how to use Thema and ONIX. So Thema shouldn't be used on its own. You can look at Thema. So this document gives you some ideas about using Thema with ONIX. It's about the information that can be expressed by a subject classification scheme and what you can complement that with in your ONIX data. I'm going to show some examples of that also. And then there's this worked examples document, which is quite useful, and there's going to be a version of this specifically about diversity and inclusion. And then there's the Thema browser. So I'm going to show you some examples of titles with suggestions of Thema codes. Now, the suggestions I'm making are just to illustrate points. They're not necessarily what the publishers themselves would use. They are all books that I've seen or I've looked at. So I haven't got many Canadian examples. I have a lot more examples of children's books or books for teenagers because there are more available lists explaining why they're on diversity. I'm not being that inclusive because I haven't got time to give you an example of every single aspect of diversity and inclusivity. So there are things I've missed out. So this one there are various codes in Thema. Thema works by post-coordination. So there isn't one subject for one thing. You can create meaning by sending multiple subjects. So if you look at this particular example, it's to illustrate that you can use two of the J codes to illustrate themes about discrimination and about integration. That will highlight a book that itself is about diversification. And also there is a specific code for the diversity and inclusivity in the workplace. Again, this is a book about gender identity. This is, again, so the main code, if you were sending this in ONIX, you always send one Thema code as your main subject. The one main subject is if somebody's got to choose one single subject, they will choose the main subject. But then in many of the examples I will show you, adding these subject codes that indicate this could be a topic suitable for our diversity pillar or in inclusivity are secondary ones. So this one, for example, we have codes to identify gender. This is fundamentally a book about design, but the subject of this book also looks at how you can make sure that design is inclusive. Inclusive in the sense that it's design thinking about people who may have disabilities. So this code it's a code that highlights a particular diversity topic. Right. Why? All the children's and teenage codes in Thema start with Y. This book is just a book about the body. It's brilliant. This is one of the books they showed me at that bookshop. I actually bought a copy because it's really good. But it uses as a secondary code the YXP. So it's a diversity and inclusivity tag. This is because this book while it talks about the body, it talks about all sorts of bodies. It talks about the body in a very child-friendly way, from birth to death, but it talks about gender identity. It shows bodies of all different colours, shapes, people in wheelchairs, but it's all done in a very inclusive way. Every single book these two women have written is done in the same way. And that flag in ONIX, this is in Thema, you can see the note. It's meant to give a chance to children's authors to flag up titles that are like this. There are many children's illustrated titles that are very inclusive. They just have illustrations or stories that just include everybody. Another aspect of flagging up things. So this one has, so this is a picture book. It's a story book. But there's two codes here I picked up from the children's section, Islam and girls and women. Because the way this picture book works, it explores both topics. It's a very good picture book. So this is a code where part of the subject is Islam and part of the subject is girls. So those two in there give somebody a flag so they can create, I'm looking for children's picture books that treat with things that to do with Islam or to do with the girls. Another book. Again, I've picked out, there's another picture storybook, picked out two codes, YNRJ and YNRP, both because the subject of these picture books are a story of two boys who live in Brooklyn. One's Jewish, one's Muslim. They meet each other and discover everything. You know, they exchange information about their respective religions. So it's a good subject code. But I've also added two qualifiers, as Thema has sets of qualifiers. These two, the 5H, and the PW, has a set of qualifiers about festivals and holidays. This book looks at Ramadan and Rosh Hashanah, because apparently in the story they fall on at the same period, which happens only every 400 years or something. So the qualifiers are also very important flags. Okay, with the children's section, a lot of the meaning in Thema is built up by using several codes. This one. There's a code for, again, this is a school story about friendship, but the diversity code here would be the YXZM, migration and refugees. This is a story about a Syrian refugee boy integrating into a school in London. The story itself is a really good example of inclusivity. The way the writer explores this story is really good. It's a really good story. I read it because I wanted to see what it was about. It's been nominated for awards in the UK. So this one, I've added the YXP code because of the way the story is. So if I was the publisher and I knew the story, I think this one should have the YXP, but as well as the refugee code. So the refugee code would be something that somebody can use to pick out, I'm looking for children's titles that talk about issues for refugees. Now, as I said, we're preparing for 1.4, Thema 1.4, and we've had feedback saying that I shouldn't have these two words together. Migration and refugees should not be in the same code heading. So that's something that we've taken account of, and we've put in the suggestions for the next update. Thema is something, I'll mention that again, but Thema is something that is evolving because the market evolves, the way we use words evolve. So we do look at that kind of thing. This is another one, another diversity topic. So again, it's a book for teenagers, but this one deals with somebody with cerebral palsy who's in a wheelchair user, and her experiences at a special camp where she discovers other people like herself. I found this on a list of books that recommended for pupils who have disabilities, written by a charity who specialise in helping children with disabilities, looking for books that give a positive image. So here again, the Y code, the YXK, is a way of highlighting the title. Sorry, I've been doing a lot of reading of teenage titles to find books to illustrate this. This one, again, this one I put in for the subject codes. The second one down, mental health. There are codes, so this one deals with problems that teenagers can face with real mental health issues. But I've also put in the qualifiers. So if you look at the three last qualifiers, there's one relating to adolescence, teenage years. That we have qualifiers in Thema that allow you to say that a particular book is about a particular subject. One of the main subjects of this book is the teenage years, dealing with mental health, but also dealing with identity. The narrator, she's a Muslim girl, and her identity as a Muslim, but also as a fan of this boys band whose lead singer happens to be transgender. Transgender is another one that we've been asked to review the wording we use for this qualifier, and we're going to review it in Thema 1.4 when the working group starts to get together, because there's more common in the English language to use the word trans. So we've had conversations with academics, people who've been writing books about trans issues, that we shouldn't be using the word transgender. But Thema is a global subject scheme. It has to be understood by people whose first language is not necessarily English. Thema is currently available in 17 languages. It's been translated, but there are a lot of people who access it through English. So we have to think about the words from those point of views as well. Sometimes with Thema, we're told that the headings are really long. Why are they so long? It's because they need to be understood by a lot of people. A retailer who uses Thema codes on a website doesn't have to use the same headings as we have. Spoiler alert. Sorry, I've spoiled the end of this one. Again, just to show an example of the codes. So the YXB, there's an LGBT code for children and teenagers. So it's in there, as well as dealing with things like death. But the qualifiers, so we have relating to gay, lesbian, and bisexual qualifier. We have, as we saw in the previous slide, a separate qualifier for transgender. But I also wanted to introduce the first of the national qualifiers. So this is within Thema, as you may know, you can have national extensions. That means a specific group can say, in our market, we need some codes that indicate this. This one came from the US group. So they wanted a code so they could highlight books that were related to Latino Americans. There are two groups, the BNC group and the BCLF group, based on language. But those two groups, for example, if Canada wanted to add national extensions, it would be through those groups, and those groups would make the suggestions if they were needed for the Canadian supply chain. And if anybody's interested in contributing to that, they should get in touch with the two organizations. Diversity about socio-economic issues. And this one I've chosen because it's a novel, but it's in translation. So there's a Thema code for fiction in translation. In many countries, fiction in translation is actually a very common subject. So we have, they're almost like qualifiers in Thema. So there's special features of fiction, which is what fiction in translation is, and then we have narrative themes. There are narrative themes like coming of age. So social issues. The inclusivity around socioeconomic issues is they're hard to spot. They're much harder to find. This one, for example, deals with growing up gay in the late 90s, early noughties in North France. And it's incredibly, it gives you a totally different vision of France, away from the Parisian-style novels and everybody's happy. This is an incredibly eye-opening account of what it's like to be poor in France. We're also using the 5PSG flag, the relating to gay people, because that's part of the story. It's a hard one. These are hard ones to identify, books about class. We have been asked to, so in the UK, Penguin Random House set up a diversity and inclusivity working group, and they have a metadata subgroup in that, and they've been looking at their own publications and at Thema, looking to see where they may think there are missing codes. And one of the codes they've identified, they've given us a whole list of really good suggestions, and one of the codes they've identified is an ability to talk about class discrimination, based on which is really strong in some countries. So that's gone as a suggestion. So with this one, again, building up meaning. So if you're choosing one section, this would go in time travel. It's one of those novels that goes, part of the story takes place in the 70s and part in the early 19th century. But again, I'm using the narrative theme, social issues. Social issues are often a way of highlighting books that could be talking about diverse or inclusivity issues. And also I wanted to use this to highlight the national qualifier relating to African Americans, which again comes from the US. Another one on national qualifiers. This is what Australia has submitted and was integrated into Thema, is they have a qualifier relating to Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. That is the term they use at the moment in Australia. It's what they asked us to add. It's the officially accepted term, but Australia is also going through a debate about the suitability of terms. So if the Australian National Group comes to us and says, actually, we no longer use those terms, we want to change it, then this can be updated. That's the importance of national qualifiers, that if you have particular needs in your market, Thema is flexible enough so we can add those. Place qualifiers, really important in Thema. You can use place qualifiers for guides, for history books, but you can also use it for fiction, both adult and children's, to identify the place. So this one takes place in Jamaica. But also, there's important information that you should be sending in ONIX. So the Willesden Bookshop people, they showed me this publisher does a lot of bilingual books, and they use a lot of them because the same story exists in many languages. This is the English and Somali version. So in ONIX, you've got the fact that it's a bilingual edition, and you've got the languages that it's in. Those languages are really important. It's really hard sometimes to find books in other languages for schools. Again, books about other places and other cultures, but this one I've put in is a translated title. This was originally written in French, so it's a really good illustrated children's book. But as it's French and translated into English, it gives a different vision to children because the trip around the world is much more geared to places that the French would know. So that's another example. Place. So it's in the title, but it's also, you can send it in the codes, because if it's there as a Thema code saying the action of this novel takes place in Harare, it's much easier to build lists, to create things using a code than it is if you're just searching through titles. But again, it's something in your ONIX. The place, the country code, you can associate information about where somebody comes from. I know it's very important to identify authors that come from Canada, so you're probably familiar with this code list, citizen of. But I talked to another bookshop in North London, specializes in books by authors from the Caribbean and from Africa. So this kind of information, they say, is really hard to find, identifying authors that are from the countries in the Caribbean or are from countries in Africa. So the country codes or region codes or cities are also information. And then you start building up lots of different bits of information. So, for example, with this title, you have a lot of access points. Every bit of metadata that you send is important to somebody. It might seem like sending too much information or I'm displaying too much information, but somebody will want that information and find it important. So on this one, you've got your Thema qualifiers for place, you've got information about the author who's from Eritrea, you've got the information of the language it was originally written in, but this one also has, in the subtitle, there's information that gives a clue to the diversity, and also in the series title. And again, as I said earlier, in the descriptive data that you send, you can also highlight these issues. Not issues. You can highlight these things. I believe this author lives in Toronto, I think. Something else that I don't think gets used enough is prize composite. In the UK, everybody's obsessed with the Costa Prize or the Booker Prize, and that's what everybody puts in the title, tries to get in. But there are many, many prizes. I found a few. If a book gets shortlisted or wins one of these prizes, there are lots of prizes that help you identify these books could be interesting. These books could be, open us towards a different kind of author. So it's worth including information about prizes in a structured way through ONIX, because somebody will find that interesting. Librarians will find that interesting. Educators who are looking for particular books, booksellers, the independent booksellers will use that information. With this one, I wanted to highlight another qualifier, 5AR, for reluctant or struggling readers. So that's another form of inclusion. It's the inclusion of those readers who feel excluded, from young readers who feel excluded because the books aren't suitable for them. So we have a flag. There are 3 flags I'm going to show you. So this one for reluctant or struggling readers who are children or teenagers, it's a really valuable bit of information to educators and to librarians when you're trying to compile a list. Most of these books will be what we call high-low, so higher interest age, lower reading age. So the publishers had this one written specifically for a reading age of 8, which is the lower half of the ONIX, but the interest age is 12 to 16. So these are really important as well. It's about including as many readers as possible. Another aspect is, as I showed you at the beginning, told you at the beginning, edition type. So this is part of DK's. Dorling Kindersley publishes a series of children's picture books that are also available as Braille editions. I saw the editor of these books give a talk. She was talking, she championed these because her daughter was born blind, and she found there was nothing she could share with her daughter. She was learning. She was talking about a very interesting concept of a first sound for when your child is born blind and doesn't understand the sounds that you are hearing. It's a fascinating talk. It's a very difficult concept to create as a book. But those edition types are important because, as she said, it was really hard for her to find physical books that were available in Braille in the trade that she could read with her daughter. This one, again, it's fiction in translation, and it's available in large type. Large type is still important in many markets, so that's another one that's important. Just actually finished reading this one. It's actually quite good. I recommend it. So another of those 5 qualifiers. So I came across this publisher. They specialize in books for people who are in mid to late stage dementia. They're picture books with quotes so that carers or family can engage in conversation through books with pictures that are easy to talk about and words that are easy to talk about. Very, very specialized publisher. There aren't many books about. So this is 5AZ, was something we introduced in the last update of Thema to help flag up those books that could be suitable for working with people. Now, again, we've had feedback that we shouldn't have included autism in this section, which is a legitimate bit of feedback. So in the next version, we're looking at how we create a code that will allow people to flag up that a book is suitable for people that are on the autism spectrum. So these little things that we do in Thema, we try and add them. They may not be for many books, but for the few books that do get those flags, they're really important for all the different bits of metadata that you can add. May not seem like there's many books, or it may not seem that it's very important, but every single bit of metadata that you can add to explore, to use the subject codes, to use keywords, to use description, but to put in things about the contributor, to put in things about prizes, anything that gives people information. The people that are looking for these books will really appreciate if that information is supplied by the publisher or is available on websites, etc. And I wanted to finish with list 196 and accessibility. So I took this example from LIA in Italy. The LIA organization in Italy is going through every digital publication that's available in Italy and is making it accessible. They then put it on a website so that every version of the book available in Italy is accessible. And they request the metadata and they display the metadata. So the bottom half of this, so you've got the ONIX metadata about accessibility, and then the bottom half is how they display it in friendly messages. Europe has just passed legislation making, they've got 6 years, like GDPR, to make all digital publications, forthcoming digital publications, accessible. You have to send the metadata. You have to make all platforms accessible, and any reading device, forthcoming reading device, has to be accessible. So list 196. So as I was saying, Thema is constantly evolving because the market and society are changing. So I've tried to give a few examples of how maybe Thema and ONIX can help flag up those titles. But there are things that are missing. There are things that you can't yet express. So you have to look at what you can do already. But if there are things that you can't do that you want to do, I'd encourage you to get involved as we're starting to think about the next version. The next version will probably come out this time next year. It takes a while to go through everything. But you should get involved with your national group. You should get in touch with the Thema group for BookNet Canada, or if you're Francophone, you should get in touch with BTLF and get involved, because we need to know what the right words are. We never add anything to any of our standards because we want to. We do it because the supply chain needs it. It's because we get requests from you.
I'm just wondering if you can speak a bit to how you sort of balance the need to be vague enough to encompass like a global experience with the need to, identify what the actual experiences are, like the code for social issues, like that can encompass so much.
That's why the Thema allows you to build up. So if you're using the fiction social issues, narrative themes are a qualifier, so they flag up something, but in the examples we give and the best practice, we encourage people to use that with something else. That is a really good question, because sometimes you can get really detailed. Some of the suggestions I was making, not everybody would want to display all that information on a public-facing website, but giving that information does help other people in the supply chain make choices. So that you may not display narrative themed social issues, or you may not display which social issues you're talking about, but it's important to give that detail. It is hard because I talked to somebody who says that there's the publisher that person worked for was reluctant to use some Thema codes in case their books got put into a pigeonhole. That they were less willing to express that there might be a diversity theme in case it was labeled as only that diversity theme. So it's something, it's balance.